Good afternoon and welcome to our Budget Choices 2025 webinar, where we will set out our proposals for Budget 2025. My name is John McGeady. I'm the CEO with Social Justice Ireland, and with me are my colleagues Michelle Murphy and Suzanne Rogers, Research and Policy Analysts, and Mansi Rawat, Economic and Social Analyst with Social Justice Ireland. The document that we will be presenting today is available to download from our website, socialjustice.ie, both at the bottom of the main article as well as in the publication section on the right-hand side of the website. As we're doing this by webinar, can I please ask if anybody has any questions to just pop them into the Q&A section on your screens. So we'll begin by setting out the context for this year's budget, bringing through some of the main proposals before taking questions at the end. So looking to the context for Budget 2025, I suppose Ireland faces major transitions in the year ahead: demographic change, digital change, economic and environmental, what the Department of Finance has referred to as the 4Ds of demography, digitalization, deglobalization, and decarbonisation. We're already taking on these challenges. These challenges have already begun, and Budget 2025 has to focus on building resilience across our society and our economy. And doing so requires investment in our infrastructure, our services, and our people. So in terms of cost of living pressures, while inflation is declining, those cost of living pressures remain. And poverty figures remain extremely high. There's well over 500,000 people below the poverty line, 560,000 people in the recent survey in income and living conditions, the SILC, and 177,000 of those are children. In terms of our infrastructure and social services, they've been inadequate for many years, particularly in areas such as housing, healthcare, and public transport. And if we want to secure Ireland's future, we need not only sound public finances, but also resilience in our infrastructure and our services, and that requires investment. We believe that government should use this budget, the last budget of this government, to do what it can to really set the agenda for the coming year in Budget 2025, and to make that one about investing in building up our national resilience in terms of infrastructure services. We've seen also the legacy of temporary measures in the last number of budgets in order to address the cost of living crisis. There were a number of measures taken by government, but some of them were temporary, some of them were permanent. And while the temporary measures disappear, the permanent measures remain, and that means that those families, largely on lower income, who benefited most from temporary measures, will see the value of those measures disappear, while those better off, who benefited from permanent changes like tax reductions, continue to see those benefits. And as a result, we see a widening gap, a widening income gap for people as a result of budget policy. Now, all of those are issues. However, we also have significant windfall surpluses, and coming from corporation tax revenue. We need to manage those carefully. They're not stable, they're not long term. But while we do have them, we need to use them not only to invest in the future, but also to invest in the present. And if they are, if we manage them carefully, we can prioritize the long-term interests of Irish society using the quite enormous windfall revenues that we've seen in recent years. In terms of the fiscal stance, there's a few things, I suppose, in terms of the fiscal context. As I've mentioned, we have large windfall corporation taxes, and these provide a skewed picture of the economy. Really, there's two economies in Ireland. There's quite a booming multinational international economy, but the domestic economy is actually quite fragile, and so we have to be cognizant of that. In terms of the political context, as I mentioned, this is the last budget of this government, and we'll have a general election in a few months' time. And whether the budget comes in October or some other time, we'll soon find out. Uncertainty continues to be a feature of the landscape. The war in Ukraine continues and has continued to have an impact, not least of all in terms of the numbers of migrants coming to Ireland, not only from Ukraine but elsewhere. And of course, the world is facing major changes, and we should expect more of that and not less as time goes on. In terms of the economic context, we've already mentioned the two-tier economy. We might also mention the fact that while we have near full employment, there is a large portion of people in our economy who, although they're in employment, are actually living below the poverty line, and well over 145,000 people. So there is a serious question being raised there about the nature of much of the employment in our economy. And of course, in terms of the social context, we already mentioned the poverty and inequality, as well as the deficits in our services and infrastructure. And they are serious threats to the long-term well-being of Irish society, and need to be addressed in the forthcoming budget. Looking to a new social contract, Socialist Ireland has for a long time advocated for a new social contract, and we believe that this really should underpin Budget 2025 and future budgets. We believe that a new social contract in the pursuit of policies in the interests of the common good need to be underpinned by 5 overarching policy outcomes. That's a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. We believe that all of the policies laid out in Budget 2025 should aim to achieve these 5 outcomes. In the past, the argument has been that, if you can get the economy right, then you've got the money to pay for everything else. But of course, we know that hasn't worked. Even though we have greater revenues than we've ever had before, at the same time as that, we have infrastructure that's not adequate. We have a significant shortage in housing. We have serious numbers of people in poverty and increasing numbers of people in homelessness. And so trying to deal with one of the 5 policy areas first and hoping the rest fall into place afterwards simply doesn't work. We need to have a vibrant economy, yes, but we also have to have decent services and infrastructure, just taxation to resource all of these things, good governance and sustainability. And of course, every aspect has to be sustainable, not merely environmental, if we want policies for the common good to sustain into the future. And in all of this, we need social dialogue. We need all 5 pillars of social dialogue: the employers, the trade unions, farmers, the community voluntary sector, and the environmental, to come together to not only plan for the future, but plan how we are going to implement and deliver those policies for the common good going forward. So in terms of Socialist Ireland's policy stance, we believe that given, as I mentioned, that we have these windfall taxes and we have a two-tier economy, we believe it is important actually to split the budget into so that we have one portion of the budget dealing with windfall revenue, and out of that windfall revenue paying for one-off projects, and the second portion of the budget being about recurring tax and spend, where we use ongoing stable taxation that is guaranteed into the future, and using that to pay for ongoing regular expenditure into the future. This has the benefit of ensuring that while taxes from windfall revenues, while revenue from windfall revenue rather, from corporate taxes, which we know are not going to be long-term. We know that they're unstable over the long run. Government has pointed this out, many others have pointed this out. But while that money is there, we need to make use of it. And we believe that 2 things should be done. One, last year, government introduced 2 funds for the future in which to invest windfall revenue. We think that's a positive step. But in addition to that, we need to use much of that revenue to address existing deficits in our infrastructure and services. And so we believe that that money should go towards one-off projects. Meanwhile, as I said, regular expenditure into the future should be funded through ongoing regular the ongoing regular tax take. So that brings us, I suppose, to the question of taxation, and I can hand you over now to Mansi Rawat, our economic and social analyst, who will speak to you about taxation. Mansi, over to you.
Thank you, John. And I will be speaking about taxation reforms. And to begin with, the cost of living pressures still remain, and as this has been mentioned by John earlier, and these ongoing challenges in inequality, participation, and living standards are leaving more and more in our society struggling. Thus, Budget 2025 must prioritize protecting the most vulnerable in our society. And to fund these protections, we need appropriate taxation. It is essential to broaden Ireland's tax base and diversify revenue sources beyond just income tax, corporation tax, and VAT. This need has been highlighted by the Commission on Taxation and Welfare, as well as European Commission. That's not to say that we are looking to increase income taxes. In fact, we are calling on the government to increase the two main income tax credits by €5 each per week, and this would mean employees gain an additional €10 per week. So few of our proposed taxation measures are, one would be like, first we need to talk about the PRSI. Ireland's PRSI is far lower than our European counterparts. While the 0.1% increase in the last budget is a step in the right direction, it is not enough to address the future shortfalls in the social insurance fund, especially given Ireland's aging population. So we are proposing that Budget 2025 starts increasing all PRSI rates by 0.5% a year for the next 5 years, starting in April 2025. And this would raise an additional 900 million in revenue. We also welcome the introduction of minimum effective rate of corporation tax for large firms, but we believe this should extend to all corporate taxpayers. We suggest phasing this in, starting with a 10% minimum rate in 2025 and increasing by 1 percentage point each year until it reaches 15% in 2030. This would bring in a stable and recurring additional 150 million in 2025 and 1.5 billion per annum from 2026 to 2030. Next, we also propose that the standard rating pension-related tax relief, like it should be standardized, and to help, this would help fund a universal state social welfare pension. This would generate 602 million in revenue in 2025, and additionally, standard rating discretionary non-pension tax reliefs could generate 152 million in 2025. These are just a few of the proposed taxation measures to broaden our tax base. For more details, you can refer to Budget Choices document, and we believe that these measures are crucial for creating a sustainable tax system that can adequately fund essential services and protections. Our approach ensures that the tax burden is fairly distributed and that our social safety net remains robust. Next, we are going to start with our investment packages focusing on housing. The recently published report by the Housing Commission highlights the need to fully account for the economic and social costs of unmet housing needs. The report reveals a severe underlying shortage of up to 256,000 homes based on the census figures. And this deficit represents a pent-up demand before considering future population growth and inward migration. We welcome this report and its findings, as these recommendations are something that we have been advocating for a long time. The housing crisis has been a pressing issue, and it's crucial that we take action now. And to make matters worse, we're also experiencing a homelessness crisis. The number of people in emergency homeless accommodation has hit a new high of 14,159 in May, which is 14% increase from last year, plus about 150,000 households are in need of long-term social housing, while the government is spending over €500 million a year on subsidy to landlords. First and foremost, we need to double our social housing stock to 20% of all housing by 2030. And to kickstart this, we are proposing an additional 1.75 billion investment in 2025 on top of what's already committed under Housing for All. Next, we need to rethink the Help to Buy scheme. It's becoming too costly and is supporting house purchases for people who don't really need the help. 1/3 of the recipients had a deposit of at least 20%, according to the PBO report. And instead, we should end the scheme and use the 200 million to expand housing first and homelessness prevention program. We also need to address the issue of vacant and derelict properties. Estimates suggest that there are properties more than 100,000 across the country. And while we welcome the vacant home tax that was introduced in 2023, we proposed that the occupancy period should be reduced to 6 months from 1 year, and we should also increase the rate to 10 times of the LPT instead of the current 5 times. We believe we also suggest that a derelict site levy should be set at 20% of the property's market value, which could bring in 16 million euros. And other than that, we also believe that investing in services and infrastructure to support social housing is crucial, and we're proposing 100 million allocation for this purpose. And to help families in long-term mortgages, we suggest an equity scheme. For those in arrears over 10 years, this scheme would provide significant relief and make mortgage payments more affordable. We propose a pilot program with 100 million investment in 2024. Finally, we need to ensure that private rental properties are fit for living. Increasing spending on private rent inspections by 9 million will help us achieve this goal and better protect tenants. To sum up, our housing policy strategy in Budget 2025 should focus on addressing the housing shortage, reducing homelessness, and ensuring better living conditions for renters. These investments are essential for creating a fairer, more sustainable, and resilient housing market for everyone. Now, I would like to hand over to Suzanne, who would talk about work and social welfare. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. You've got a lot of the heavy hitters out of the way already now with the taxation and housing. They're the two biggest pieces there. We'll be very, very, very quick running through this now because I think we're sort of slightly behind our schedule. In terms, I suppose, of work and social welfare, we see them as, sort of coexisting in the same space. The first one really is to move the national minimum wage towards the real living wage. And a lot of the headlines we're seeing at the moment are about rates of inflation somewhat coming under control, but many of us are still seeing elevated costs in the supermarket, in our fuel bills, in our housing costs. So the impact is on the real value of our earnings, and it's particularly for those in low paid employment. Even though we're currently experiencing full employment with an employment rate of around the 4%, the reality behind this statistic reveals a really quite troubling picture of economic hardship. So when we look at those who are in employment, what we're seeing are people who are working and still below the poverty line, and also people who are underemployed as well. So those who are in part-time or precarious employment who would like to work more hours or would, appreciate having a contract that would be, I suppose, a bit more sort of provide a bit more security. And I think, the key thing really here is the difference between minimum wage and living wage. You're talking of a difference of about €85 a week between those two figures. So I think that is a sizable figure. And when we look at costs over the last couple of years, just one statistic I want to throw out: the price of nappies has increased by 84% over the last 4 years. So I just think that that's an incredible jump in what would be classed as an essential for many households. And I suppose in terms of maybe, moving more and more of us towards employment and better employment, we really need to get to look at the resources that are available for training, upskilling and higher education. Many of us will be in jobs for longer. We will have more than one career. The skills that we had in the 80s are not the skills that are needed now. The children who are leaving school in 24 and 25, the jobs that they will have in 30 and 40 years' time will require constant training and upskilling. And again, looking at the tax system, we are looking to introduce a system of refundable tax credits at the cost of 140 million. Well, this would really be looking at the tax credit that you don't use, that it's now put back into your, into your pocket at the end of the year. And again, the full, I suppose, the long grass of that, if we want to get into the weeds of that, it's in our document, and it's also in our socioeconomic review as well, which was only just published there earlier this year. The core social welfare rates, then again, we're calling for an increase again this year of 25 per week at a cost of 933 million. and to equalise the job seekers rates for those who are under 25, because they currently receive a reduced rate, and that would cost 63 million. And I think for context here, I think this is really important. I never thought I would be so jaded that I would lose sight of what millions and billions actually mean. The cost of poverty, according to Vincent de Paul and Micheál Collins' work that they've done, is roughly 4.5 billion a year. That's the damage done by poverty, and that's the amount of money that the state spends trying to undo it. And again, I think when we look at 933 million versus 4.5 billion, a million seconds is less than 12 days. I came across this recently and it really hit home with me. A million seconds is less than 12 days, and a billion seconds is nearly 32 years. So in order of I suppose, degrees of magnitude, and the real difference between 933 million and 63 million versus 4.5 billion, like we are talking, completely different, completely different conversations. So this is an investment in our people to make sure that they can put the heat on, the light on, food on the table. And again, to really, looking at those under 25 who are currently not in employment, even to be job ready, I think would require a sort of higher rate of income every week. So I'm going to move then quickly on to the next slide then, which is to look at supports for the community and voluntary sector. So again, looking right the way across the system, like the community and voluntary sector continually proves to be a vital part of our national response to the multiple crises we've experienced across Irish society in recent years. The sector provides supports in housing, health, care for people, care for the environment, as well as protecting households from the worst effects of deprivation and inclusion. Government relies really quite heavily on the sector, and yet cuts to funding since 2008 were still not fully restored. So again, we're asking for an increase in funding of 60 million. Again, our friends in the PPNs, valuable, really important work that funding be increased, especially in terms of, I suppose, bedding in sort of staff structures. Youth services, again, cannot stress this enough, calling for extra supports for youth services of 15 million. In 2023, there's an estimated 1.2 million people, children aged under 18. So these are 23% of the overall population. They've come through what hopefully will be a once in a lifetime experience of a global pandemic. And that has had an impact on their sports, their cultural activities, their social formation. And these, I suppose, youth services and, more importantly, youth workers really provide vital spaces for young people to learn and grow away from school and away from their family. The Legal Aid Board, again, this is a key one for us. And there's much more, I suppose, in the document itself on this community section, just trying to pull out a few bits and pieces here. Again, this is becoming more and more important, I think, especially with anybody trying to access their rights through, the international protection system, access to housing, key things here, that the Legal Aid Board be correctly funded or adequately supported. And again, that last one then really is, again, looking to support the data that we collect on our population projections, which will really allow us to be able to put in place that key infrastructure that will support our changing population as we go forward. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand it across to Michelle to carry on with the next couple of slides. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. So I'm going to cover, I think, 4 or 5 slides. I'm not going to go through the detail of every single bullet point on each slide. I'll just pick out a couple that I suppose we'd really like to focus on. As Mansi said earlier, all the detail is in the document, which is on the website. So first up is rural Ireland and the regions. And I suppose we're looking here at how you build regional resilience, investing in social infrastructure and services to make sure that communities across rural Ireland and the regions can take full advantage of any opportunities that come about in terms of moving to a greener economy and society, green jobs, and then can take advantage of any of the opportunities that digitalization and AI presents, and at the same time negate or mitigate any of the negative impacts. So I'm really going to focus on just the first bullet here. So funding for regional development and transition, and we're looking for an investment of 100 million euros here too. So this is really to invest in things to support resilient communities. So smart villages and the infrastructure to support remote working, the delivery of the EU Smart Cities programme, sort of more education for farmers in terms of moving to sustainable agricultural methods and how this might be rolled out, and looking at pilot projects and how these can be scaled up, developing local cooperatives and regional farm to fork strategies in line with the Green New Deal, looking at improving public services to promote and support rural living. So what communities and rural dwellers actually need and how we might provide that. And then looking at the work that has already been done in terms of the pilot projects on rural proofing, scaling these up and using the learning from these to develop a very robust rural proofing framework. And by rural proofing, I mean that people in rural areas have access to the same services and infrastructure that those in more urban areas that would have. And finally, then the expansion of living labs in every region, focusing on things like plastics, renewables, zero carbon buildings, agroecology, to ensure that we have a more balanced regional development as we go forward. Now, I'll move on then to the next slide, which is we're looking at healthcare. And we know that we're still rather focused on the acute care model and hospitals rather than primary care. And we do welcome progress to date in terms of rolling out community healthcare networks, but we do need more sustained investment in GPs, GP practices, primary care and community-based services. So I'm just going to focus here in particular on more investment in enhanced community care. So this would support the delivery of the regional health areas and to ensure that we actually transform our health service in line with Sláinte Care. And in addition, beyond that 100 million in advanced community care, we should see, we should mirror that in terms of investment in community health networks and improving access to, or universal access to GP care. So it goes beyond just providing the card to provide the access. We do also need to invest in actually expanding the number of GPs, the number of GP practice teams that we have across the country, and also expanding, I suppose, the breadth of experience we have in those teams. If we're really going to deliver those regional health areas and healthcare to meet demands, that we need the expertise within those teams locally to be able to deliver things such as occupational therapy, mental health supports, nutritional supports, for example. So we really want to focus on those two things, which are really key to support the rollout of Sláinte Care. Moving then to disability and carers, which is the next slide. Here, I'll just focus in terms of disability. I mean, we all know the challenges that this cohort face. They have higher levels of poverty consistently, higher levels of deprivation, and you know, their labour market participation is lower than the population in general. We've consistently called for a cost of disability payment. We did welcome the one-off acknowledgement and the one-off payment of this in not the previous budget, the one before. We're looking for a weekly cost of disability payment of €20 a week in the forthcoming budget. And this is just a step towards acknowledging the additional costs that people with a disability face, and that those costs should not be borne by them alone. Secondly, in terms of carers here, we would support the implementation of an independent review of the carers allowance and all the challenges in terms of the allowance and how it interacts with household income. And also the pilot of a universal basic services and a universal basic income scheme for carers. We're looking for 10 million to develop this pilot, in line with the programme for government commitment to a carers guarantee, which is yet to be delivered. And we're in the last year of this programme for government and the last year of this government. And really, I mean, it's a small amount of money to deliver on what was one of the key commitments in that programme for government. Now, moving to education then, which is the next slide. So first here, we're just looking at primary and second level education. I just want to focus on, again, two areas here. So the first is students with special educational needs and students with additional educational needs. So we're looking for 100 million to provide an additional 300 special school places in 12 new special schools, and also to increase the provision of special classes in mainstream schools. So this is the minimum that's required in this budget to begin to deliver on the commitments to students with special needs and additional needs. I mean, we hear every year the challenges that family faces. We're hearing again this year on people can't find places for children in primary school, or those who may have had a place in primary school, but in that transition to second level, there's no place available. So 100 million is the minimum that's required here. And then the second area I would like to highlight is the expansion of the JCSB library project to all debt secondary schools. So this is a commitment made more than 10 years ago, actually now. So the total cost for this would be approximately 20 million plus euro. We're looking for this on a phased basis over 5 years. So 5 million for the first phase, for the first tranche of schools in budget 2025, and so on out to 2030. Because what we can see, despite our progress in the PISA results, if you look at it by socioeconomic profile, we still haven't closed that gap of literacy for students in debt schools and students in non-debt schools. So, this is a very cost-effective way to do that. So moving on again then to further and higher education. Here I'll just focus again on first, an increase of investment in further education and training, looking at expanding apprenticeships and traineeships to meet future skills needs, and look at things like the new technology we're using in terms of home building and how that can be maintained over time. Also, there is a core funding gap that has been identified at a higher education level. It was identified in Funding the Future. That gap is over 300 million, so we need an additional 100 million as a first step actually towards closing that gap in budget 2025. Moving on then to children. Another vulnerable group, as Suzanne pointed out earlier. So I'm just going to focus here again on two particular areas. So the first is in terms of early childhood care and education. We are looking for a 0.1% increase in GNI star of investment in this area in budget 2025. So that's about 307 million euro. That will support staff professionalisation, the expansion of this provision through the Irish language, and increased investment in non-contact time to allow the staff to do all the paperwork and all that other work behind the scenes that has to be done after they have completed their daily work of actually interacting with the children in these services. The second area here then is a poverty prevention mechanism, and it's child benefit. So we're looking for an increase in child benefit of 50 euros per month. We know it's a key route to tackle child poverty, particularly for families on the lowest incomes. And in addition, we are looking for increases in the qualified child payment. So 6 euros in the qualified child allowance for children under 12, and an increase of 11 euros for children who are aged 12 and over in the forthcoming budget. And obviously there's further detail on all of those proposals in the document. Moving on then to older people, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Mansi, who will take you through our proposals on older people.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'm going to talk about older people services. As you all know, we are an aging population. That is a success story, but government hasn't planned adequately for the shift. This has left many older people without the necessary secure accommodation, health and social support needs, as well as adequate income. And older people are especially vulnerable to the cost of living pressures. As highlighted earlier, although the inflation is coming under control, the cost of living pressures still remain. And because they overwhelmingly rely on a fixed income to make ends meet, they are especially vulnerable to these pressures. In 2023, as per the SILP data, without these temporary cost of living measures, the poverty rate among older people would have doubled. After the cost of living measures, it was 8.3%, but in reality, it would have been 16.9% because, and this is particularly worrying because cost of living measures were temporary, and it also highlights the need for sustainable solutions rather than short-term fixes. So we are calling on the government to increase the state contributory and non-contributory pension by 25 euro per week, and to introduce universal state social welfare pension in budget 2025. Also, to support aging, having homes, adequate facilities at home is important, and most older people want to age well at home, and so we are proposing the government to reinstate the funding for housing adaptation grants, which were cut in 2010, and even now they haven't been restored in full. So we need an additional 85 million in 2025 for this. We also want the introduction of a statutory right to home care promised in 2021 but not yet delivered, and an increase in current home care provision by 96.4 million in 2025. The community and voluntary sector, as mentioned by Suzanne earlier, plays a very crucial role in supporting older people at home. And we need a multi-annual increase in funding for them, starting with a 50 million in 2025. And with just under 4% of the older population living in nursing homes and the additional complex needs that many have, we propose an additional 27.3 million for 500 nursing home beds. And finally, on safeguarding, more than a third of all reports made by the HSC Safeguarding Office were from people above the age of 65. So we are calling on the government to establish an independent safeguarding authority at an initial cost of 3 million in budget 2025. And now I'll hand it back to Michelle to talk about just transition.
Thank you, Mansi. So I'm going to take you just through some of the proposals here that we have around supporting, I suppose, Ireland's move to a greener society and economy, and this transition, this change, and obviously to make sure that it's socially equitable, that it's just, and that those who will be most impacted will be most supported, but also to make sure that everyone and every sector makes a contribution to Ireland's emissions reduction. So I suppose I'm going to focus on a couple of things here, but the first one is to implement an aviation tax on commercial air travel. So we're proposing that this should be implemented in the budget to yield 215 million euros. This would ensure that one of the most polluting travel sectors actually makes a contribution to our carbon budgets for the transport sector in line with the polluter pays principle and the Environment Liability Directive, while giving government the opportunity to continue to proactively pursue the removal of the exemption of jet kerosene, which is the fuel that airplanes use, from excise and carbon taxes at EU level. When every member of the population is making a contribution, when individuals and households cannot avoid carbon tax, when the transport sector in terms of road hauliers, car users, private transport operators, tour operators, bus operators are all making a contribution to the carbon budgets for the transport sector, then I mean it's only fair that the aviation sector, which is a highly profitable sector, makes a contribution as well. Then moving to another sector which has substantial emissions, which will find it very challenging to meet its emissions ceiling, the agricultural sector. We're proposing the piloting of a farm sustainability passport scheme, so a 5 million euro investment in this in budget 2025 to support farmers to move to more environmentally friendly and sustainable agricultural methods. And for many of them, it'll be moving back to methods that were used previously and then fell out of favor, in newer methods, more emissions intensive methods were supported. But it's to allow farmers to do this in a step-by-step process, without maybe taking on substantial debt, and to show that they're doing this over a period of time, to take on those changes, to look what impact these changes have, to move in a more considered way to environmentally friendly methods, and to look at the impact that these methods have on emissions and what can be scaled up and supported. And continuing in this vein, we would see that 20 million could be invested in a pilot program for a building renovation passport scheme as well, to support households for a gradual step-by-step approach to retrofitting. We all know that retrofitting is one of the key means of reducing emissions. It's a very cost-effective way, but there are still substantial upfront costs for households. So by introducing this passport scheme for households, it would allow them to take a step-by-step approach to this, for example, starting with just installing triple glazed windows, new doors, then looking at maybe insulating your attic and all those different approaches, which takes away that immediate leap and gap in terms of the initial upfront costs. So there's far more detail on page 14, but these are three key areas I would like to focus on, because they ensure that one sector will make a contribution, and it will support those other sectors which are attempting to make a contribution, and individuals, both in terms of households, in terms of retrofitting, and farmers to look at their farm practices. And now I'm going to pass over to Suzanne, who is going to talk to us about international protection.
Thanks, Michelle. I suppose, again, just to put this into a bit of context, excuse me, as of May 2024, we had 30,463 people living in the direct provision and emergency international protection accommodation system, spread across 295 locations. 4 of those locations are listed as being temporary tented sites. In contrast, and in addition to those seeking international protection, by February 2024, we had 104,870 Ukrainian refugees in this country. So this is an enormous amount of people entering into the country. And when we look at sort of, other statistics, the Parliamentary Budgetary Office spring commentary of this year, inward net migration is projected to be about 35,000 a year from 2026 to 2030. But bearing in mind that this figure has been exceeded in past years, 2008, I think, was probably the highest number of people entered the country in that year, and we didn't quite have the same tensions in 2008 that we're seeing now. And again, homelessness has been an ongoing issue for the last 10, 12 years, and we haven't had the same sort of tensions around it as we have now. So this is becoming, I suppose, a boiling point in terms of people arriving in this country seeking refuge. And it's quite a small number when you look at the overall numbers entering the country. Most people coming into the country are here to, they have their accommodation lined up, they have their job lined up. So it's this relatively small cohort of people who are coming, fleeing war, fleeing persecution in other countries. So again, that Ireland is a safe, secure place to come and live and raise a family, again, is, as Nancy said, another success story. And I suppose, the money does need to be spent in implementing the white paper, which, again, anybody who's listening who's not familiar with it, lots more detail in the review and in this document. But the Housing Commission, the recent report from the Housing Commission, again, I suppose, reiterates that the white paper should really remain the primary basis for reform of the international protection accommodation system. So again, just reiterating that this is the plan. We have it, we just need to really deliver on it. And I suppose looking then at those sort of vulnerability assessments, anybody who's coming into this system has come from, actually, I can't even begin to imagine what they've left behind. So we really need to ensure that the vulnerability assessments are being put in place, that people are really being provided with the supports that they need. And I think as well, in terms of the accommodation, it really needs to be in areas that have links to schools and shops and employment opportunities, transport links, community support networks. They all need to be there. And again, the Parliamentary Budgetary Office had a piece there not too long ago where they looked where, unfortunately, a vast majority of these accommodation centres are situated in areas that are already experiencing deprivation. So again, we really need to be, putting these supports in place really, really carefully, looking at, I suppose, just ensuring that the supports are given to these people who have coming here with, again, trauma, difficult journeys to come into the country, and support them to integrate and to make their homes here. So I'm going to pass back to John now, I think, to sort of see us out for the last couple of slides. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. So I suppose one of the final items that we'll talk about is the overseas development assistance and Ireland's international commitments in relation to helping some of the poorest people across our world. Budget choices, in Budget Choices, Socialist Ireland recommends that we actually provide an overall package of €1 billion for overseas assistance in 2025, and that this €1 billion should come from windfall revenues. So first of all, we need to move towards our international commitment of 0.7% of GNI star for overseas development assistance. And we have set out a pathway for achieving this, and we believe that in 2025, as a step towards that, we need to move to 0.53% of GNI star. We have also made commitments around climate finance and also loss and damage costs for people in countries in the global south. The government is making strong strides towards its commitment of 225 million to be allocated for climate finance. However, at present, government is including that within the overseas development assistance. And in actual fact, they're two separate commitments, and therefore Socialist Ireland strongly recommends that government's funding towards climate finance should actually be disaggregated from the funding towards overseas development assistance. And doing that actually leaves us further behind than we thought we were. And therefore, I think it's very important that that government take advantage of Budget 2025 to progress on that policy. And again, that's why we're recommending quite a hefty package of €1 billion towards that. And of course, we have those revenues from windfall taxes, and therefore it's important to be able to use them in a way that actually is socially just and takes account of the fact that we live in a very, very unequal world. In the same vein as that, we also recommend a €1 billion fund to address world hunger, and again that should be taken from windfall. Again, recognizing that there is an awful lot of injustice across the world, and it's important that we take advantage of our wealth in order to do so. And finally, we recommend that at present costs around supporting Ukrainian refugees who come to Ireland are included in overseas development assistance, even though that money is not spent overseas, it's spent in Ireland. And we would recommend that actually should be ring-fenced and separated out from overseas development assistance as well, as we move towards our 0.7% of GNI star. So I suppose I'll just move on now to looking at the actual costings and a summary of the various packages that we've discussed this afternoon. So again, in terms of our budgetary stance, we recommend that government split the budget in two, that it have windfall, that it have one-off investment based on windfall revenues, and then a kind of a normal budget based on ongoing taxation and ongoing expenditure. So what we can see is that in terms of windfall expenditure, we recommend that government spend €5.95 billion in Budget 2025. But in terms of the rest of the expenditure, we're looking at housing, looking at 31 million. While we are looking at 31 million for housing, it should also be said that we are looking at, or we're asking for that 1.75 billion investment in social housing, and that would actually be part of that windfall of 5.95 billion expenditure. We're also asking for 370 million for just transition, 593 million for rural, regional and community development, 1.13 billion for social welfare, and 1.14 billion for pensions and older people. The proposals for health and disability and cares come to 942 million. For education, it comes to 543 million. For children and families, it comes to 1.5 billion. And for international protection, it comes to 71 million. But again, just on that 71 million, it should be said that in terms of the implementing the accommodation recommendations of the white paper on ending direct provision, the 600 million that we've advocated for that should actually come from the windfall expenditure, the 5.95 billion in windfall expenditure. And finally, in terms of raising revenue, our proposals around capital and corporation tax should bring in 1.05 billion euro, and our increases to income tax should ultimately come into a net benefit of a net revenue of 320 million, even though we have those income tax credits of €5 for both tax credits. In total, one-off expenditure, as you said, comes to 5.95 billion, while once we take all of our expenditure and tax proposals together, it actually provides a surplus of the recurring budget of 85 million euro, leaving us in the good. So that's the summary of our packages. I suppose what we can do now is take any questions that any of you may have. If you want to pop them in the chat, and we will into the Q&A, and we'll endeavour to address any of them. And I see a few of them may already be coming in. So we have a question here from for Suzanne around the 60 million for community and voluntary sector. Suzanne, any sense of what that would go towards?
I suppose the first thing to say is that it differs from Mancy's 50 million for the older persons in the community and voluntary sector. So that's a separate line that comes down in terms of I think it's in section 38 and 39, isn't it, Mancy, in terms of older care. I mean, this is really to be spread right the way across the system. You're looking at staff costs, again, just to make sure that they're in line with, increases to national minimum wage and obviously everything that comes with that. But you're really trying to provide out, or to spread out the services that are provided by the community and voluntary sector. And when you go into local communities, I keep going back to this point, we live our lives locally. This is where the action is. National policy operates at one level, but you and I, we're concerned about what supports are available to us in our local level. And again, I'm conscious urban Ireland has, different issues to rural Ireland. It will allow for people to meet together in community spaces, community art spaces. It will allow for young people to get together, older people, the men's sheds, all of these things. So it goes right the way across. Like, I suppose the community and voluntary sector is such a wide and all-encompassing, it's the tentacles are everywhere. So it's a big question, and it's probably an even bigger answer. But it's what was the name of that Oscar-winning movie? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. So that's really where that money would be going into. And again, it's to really, I suppose, to recognise the importance of the sector, to ensure its continuance with staff who this kind of know where they're at in terms of their wages, in terms of their contracts. And I think, again, trying to undo the cuts from 2008, again, just trying to make up that difference, I think really would be the key one there. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. I have another question here. Could you say a little more about SGI's proposal to split the budget? Sounds like an interesting way of ensuring we don't spend beyond our means. And that is precisely the intention of splitting the budget. I suppose two things on that. One is that absolutely ensures that regular expenditure, ongoing recurring expenditure, is funded through stable revenue, revenue that we know is going to come in year on year, revenue that's not going to suddenly dry up whenever surplus windfall taxes come in. And we know that the Department of Finance and others have pointed out their concern about windfall revenues, that despite the fact that they're extremely high, they do expect them to begin to fall. And of course, now that we have also signed up to the increased corporation tax for corporations with a turnover above 750 million, as part of the BEPS deal, we should see corporations move some of their profit making towards other countries, towards other tax zones where they're actually raising that revenue, whereas at present many of them may only be using Ireland as a place in order to declare them. So in that regard, it ensures that taxes are stable, but it also ensures that we actually do make use of those revenues now when we have them. And I suppose there are two things. One, we need to use the revenues to protect the future, and government has already taken steps around setting up the two funds, the Future Ireland Fund and the Infrastructure Climate Nature Fund. But in addition to securing our public finances for the future, it's also important that we embed resilience into our services and our infrastructure. And we know that there are already major deficits in place there already. So, while we're looking to the future, I suppose the first step in securing the future is getting the present right. And therefore, splitting it this way allows us to make that investment today. So, for example, the substantial package of 1.75 billion that would be invested in social housing is a way for us to actually double the target for social housing in 2025, which clearly is necessary, and as Mansi has spoken about, and as we know the Housing Commission has said. So that's the idea of splitting the budget. We have another question here. Could you say a little bit more about your proposal for a farm sustainability passport and a building renovation passport scheme? So maybe, Michelle, I'll put that question to you.
Yep. So the building renovation passport scheme, so that's something that's also been proposed by the Irish Green Building Council. So it's basically each household that takes it upon itself to do some retrofitting would get a passport, for want of a better word, which would allow you to do it over time, but you can use different providers then so people can see what you've done. It would mean you could still access grants partially, because you're not going to be doing the full retrofit at the one time, but it still enables people to access grants. It takes away that, I suppose, that initial fear of having to take on a significant amount of debt or spend perhaps a large portion of any savings you may have in order to retrofit your home. So it allows a more cost-effective and step-by-step approach for households that may not have all the resources available to them to do that on an upfront basis, and who may not also qualify then for, the full grants that are available through the SEAI. This was the same goes for the farm sustainability passport. There's different sectors of farming which have different levels of emissions. Not every farm is the same. So this would allow farmers to, take on different farming methods or make different changes, for example, to ensure that they qualify for certain schemes and certain financial supports. But again, it would allow them to do that on a graduated basis, obviously taking into account the different requirements that are there. I suppose the dairy sector, was a very different sector to the tillage sector or the sheep sector or the beef sector. So it takes into account those differentiations. And again, it allows farmers more security. It would be a means then of maybe reorganizing some of the incentives so that they're targeted at those farmers that are implementing changes, that they would get a greater proportion of any incentives that are available. And again, give them some certainty in I suppose, a very uncertain time, and also allow them to track themselves the changes they are making. And I think it would allow the sector, I suppose there's a lot of noise around the sector. This is the making changes. Way of
I think we might be losing
the
there,
sector
Michelle.
is making. Apologies on it. Would allow us the sector to track the impact of the changes it's making and see how they're impacting on the carbon ceilings.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Michelle. Another question here, maybe Suzanne, for this one's for you, I think. Could you say a little bit more about your proposal for the PPNs?
Yeah, I suppose just to expand, I suppose where we would see that money going. The PPNs are the public participation networks. They're situated in every local authority across the country. That again would go some way to ensuring that staff are well recompensed for the job that they're doing, that their contracts are secure, that there would be career progression within the systems. And I think also to support the work that they do. They are a bit like us in the sense, again, they're everything, everywhere, all at once, all the time. Because they are representative of their communities, they do an enormous amount of consultations, they make an enormous amount of submissions. Because they're not either group focused or issue focused, it will be everything that they're involved in. They're becoming more and more involved, I suppose, in environmental issues and climate action issues, again, at a local level. So ideally, everything that happens at a local level, at local authority level, all the decisions that are made at local authority level should really be put through that PPN filter, so that the voices of the community in Clare, in Mayo, in Louth, in Dublin City Centre, all of those voices are sort of filtered through the PPN and then into local authority decision making. But that requires resources, that requires expertise. Again, because the system relies a lot on volunteers, you're trying to make sure that your volunteer, your secretariat, your representatives, all of your community and voluntary groups, all of your social inclusion groups, your environmental groups, I think we're up to about maybe almost 19,000 member groups across the country. So it's a formidable force. But again, to try and get the best out of that, it really will be about supporting them in the work that they do. And it's just to, I suppose, again, just to sort of keep the conversation out and about. It would help in their communication structures, getting the information out to communities that they exist, that they're there. So again, really just sort of supporting and I suppose moving forward the work of the PPNs, who will be celebrating 10 years this year. So again, I think it'll be, another good time to sort of, shout hurrah from the rooftops and look at the incredible work that they do across the country.
Great, thanks very much, Suzanne. I don't see any other questions coming in. We do have a comment. Congratulations for proposing that the overall tax take be increased. This is essential if Ireland is to provide the infrastructure a growing population will need. And I suppose it's very nice to hear that, because obviously most people, whenever they hear the tax being increased, don't like hearing it. But of course, it is absolutely essential if we're to meet our demand on resources, especially with a growing population and demographic change. So it's absolutely essential. We are now just past 1 p.m. So I think we can probably wrap up. There are no other questions coming in. So I suppose just to thanks everybody today for tuning in and joining us. All our proposals are available. All the proposals are in Budget Choices 2025, our document, which is on the website and can be downloaded from www.socialjustice.ie. If you'd like any further information, don't hesitate to get in touch through, again, via the website or by email to secretary@socialjustice.ie. Any of your comments or questions or feedback is always absolutely welcome. We will, of course, be responding to Budget 2025 the day after it's announced. And again, we'll have our budget critique and analysis out the following day, and that will be also broadcast by webinar and in Buswell's Hotel. So you can put that in your diary whenever Budget Day comes around. Whether it's the second Tuesday in October this year or not, we'll see. And so once again, thank you to my colleagues, to Michelle Murphy, to Mansi Rawat, and to Suzanne Rogers, and thank you all.